facilities. So if you look at the aggregation of all of those, of course we're the largest electricity consumer. And what Gavin is saying is if you want to add all the public facilities, public utilities, I guess except the two power companies, but if you want to add hospital authority, if you want to add the airport, the railway is a listed company, but okay, let's say the MTR, the public sector, I think like in many other places, of course it is the biggest energy consumer. Question, how are we doing in the public sector? Now, for government buildings, 10 years ago, we had a 6% electricity reduction, so for the first 5 years, then we had another 5 years, and now we've just committed to another 5 years. And I think everybody understands that every time you go lower, it's harder, because you've creamed off the low-hanging fruit. So in the last policy address, you know, we committed to another 5%. Now, as you go down on energy efficiency, there are really two aspects. One is better management. The other one is retrofitting. You may need new lighting system, air conditioning systems, and so on. That does cost money. So the question is how Hong Kong is going to finance all of this. So there is actually an interest in energy efficiency financing, particularly for the private sector. So I would say to you that in energy efficiency in government, in the 8,000 facilities, we are a leader in Hong Kong, and we'd like the private sector now to follow. So the question going forward is, and we're thinking about it, and we will be telling you what we're going to do, how we are going to stimulate and energize the private sector.
So this is, just so I can clarify, you mentioned earlier there's a consultation coming up on the scheme of control, and then there'll be alongside that some another the demand side discussion coming up as well, the energy efficiency side.
So what I'm saying is, for 2015 and 2016, there'll be very major across-the-board discussion about energy saving, both on the supply side and the demand side. So this does require us to have very extensive discussion with sectors, with large users. So how can we have this conversation? We can't organize it all within government. So what would be extremely useful is for organizations like BEC, PwC, Civic Exchange, and many others who are present today, as we come forward in 2015 and 2016 on these discussions, we're going to need help from different organizations to have extensive discussions on what we're going to actually do. So it's not about just an idea of let's have a target, have an ambitious target. We need to set some of these targets together because it is about the private sector spending a lot of money. Now, I do want to just make one more point about Hong Kong, which may be different from other cities and other jurisdictions. In many places, the government uses financing, uses debt to finance major infrastructure projects and retrofits and so on. In Hong Kong, and this is very different from many other parts of the world, our government pays cash for everything. Now, I'm not going to pass a judgment on this particular point, but if people also, the financial services sector, if people have some different ideas of how Hong Kong may finance its ongoing infrastructure going forward, that is better for Hong Kong. This is also a time into the future of having discussions with the financial sector.
So the door is open to innovate and to really drive this discussion further in Hong Kong at this point.
Now, there's argument to say we can afford it, let's just pay for it. And we do need to take this point into account as well. But it's a huge difference between Hong Kong and other places.
There was one question in the back first, and then another one in the front.
Okay. I just want to clarify this target thing, sorry. The proposal was originally in 2010, And now I see that there was a report to the electrical in April last year. So I assume that the government take it as adopted. We have a target of carbon intensity reduction of 50 to 60, because I have always thought that it has not been officially adopted. At least it has not been, and now I see that it is not very widely publicized. So I guess a lot of people, even very closely following, may miss that moment of adoption or announcement. I don't know. Okay, but that's not the big issue. That's not a big issue. I just wonder whether Hong Kong government will, or private sector will support Hong Kong government to introduce more regulatory requirements on the demand side, so that we have a better chance of achieving a carbon reduction target that we set forward. Thank you.
So I think the comment from before is that there is a number of different avenues being explored at the moment, and the discussion will happen as the scheme of control consultation unfolds and the energy efficiency policy document comes out. And then we'll, I guess, there's a number of carrot and stick approach, would probably be a mixed bag of some sort that might be coming through.
I think there were two issues that were raised. The second one was, will the private sector be willing to go along? I think this is a better question for people in the audience. The first issue wasn't so much a question, was the government didn't publicize our adoption of the 50 to 60% target. A paper to LegCo, it's about as clear a commitment as we can make politically. So if people have missed it, maybe the media wasn't very interested, or maybe you haven't followed it very closely. Now, permit me for being upfront about this. I'm shocked to hear that people who are following don't know. And this is the first time I've been told that people didn't know.
So the 50 to 60% that was published in 2010 and then presented to LegCo again in 2013, this is the target, this is it. In case anyone else wondered. Gavin?
Yeah, it's there, it's in black and white. There's also a conversion to an absolute target or a range as well. But still, the discussion for Lima, for Paris and post-Paris, is a post-2020 longer term discussion on targets and timelines, such as the 2030 target that we heard here as well. So we have a target, but it's on a time frame which is shorter than the global discussion that's happening. So a short-term target is important, but so will be a longer-term target as well.
Alex?
Well, and just very quickly from the private sector side, the point has already been made that what businesses and investors look for is certainty, predictability, ideally some kind of long-term plan so they know what's coming, but really most importantly, logical policy and policy that doesn't change.
There was a question in the back, or in front of you. Yeah, there's a lady in front of you.
Sorry, just a quick comment. To ease maybe the work of the financial sector, and as Andrew was mentioning, to increase the transparency, maybe an accounting, like a carbon accounting system could be set. So basically, investors have a way to find out about the carbon cost of different infrastructure programs, or maybe different transportation systems.
There was another lady right next to you. And then we'll give it to Robert because he's been raising his hand.
Getting tired. Thank you. I'm Flora from the Green Building Council in Hong Kong. I would like to have a question for Christine, and which is very happy to hear just now about the government commitment. And in reducing energy and the overall sustainability in the building sector. And as the council, it's the certification body for the local certification scheme. We understand and we really see the very encouraging signs of Hong Kong government engaging in a lot of green buildings in Hong Kong, because all of the new government buildings actually adopt the BEAM Plus, the local certification scheme. But I would like to have two questions for Christine. First of all is there actually a more commitment, especially when you talk about we have 8,000 buildings for the Hong Kong government in existing premises that you're managing. So far, in our number, in terms of our existing building rating scheme, we have 2 government buildings. One, the EMSD headquarters has just achieved the provisional platinum, and the other is the Kwai Sing West Estate. And that is so far only 2 projects that have achieved, or that actually attempted the existing building scheme in Hong Kong in kind of displaying the public pledge of reducing the energy and over sustainability of government buildings. And the other thing is a more critical question, is when we talk to our stakeholders about why don't you adopt the existing building rating system to retrofit your buildings, and very often we come across that, well, for new buildings we have some government incentives, and for the existing buildings so far there's not really a matching, especially financing policy to support the local businesses. And talking about some statistics, right now after running the scheme for 4 years in Hong Kong, we have 8 existing building projects as compared to almost 600 new building projects that attempt for new building assessment. So I would like to know the responses of Christine on these 2 issues. Thank you.
I'm not sure I catch all the numbers, but let's look at what we have: new buildings and existing buildings. And for new buildings, to get BEAM Plus rating, they need to go through various assessments. Also, if they get the assessment, this is all buildings in Hong Kong, there's also a financial incentive, right? So government has put that in place. Now, for government new buildings, we have made a commitment that they should all be at least gold rating. And I keep repeating this everywhere because people really don't know what a fantastic commitment this is. That does not, our buildings don't necessarily, that the operational buildings don't necessarily include the very large number of public housing. From 2015 to 2016, as you know, all public housing must be gold ready or better. This is a fantastic financial commitment from the government and other public sector developers. That's the URA, the Housing Society. Essentially, they're going for the same kind of standard. So a lot of the new government backed buildings that are coming out will have really the highest ratings. Then you have the so-called semi-private sector. You talk to the airport authority, and everything that they're building are phenomenally designed for energy efficiency and water efficiency and so on. Top class in the world. So new buildings. Older buildings, if it's government retrofit, yes, we're going to need taxpayers' money to do it. So by committing to a further 5% energy savings, it will mean some of them need to be retrofitted, not just through management. And we need to argue internally within government where the money is coming from. Okay? But we've made a 5% commitment. Okay, going forward to the private sector, how can we get private sector buildings to recommission building and retrofit? Where's the money going to come from? Now, one suggestion is public sector, you pay for it. Seriously? How are we going to get that money from LegCo? Give money to private sector buildings? However, having said that, do you know that government has already put out the largest sum of money in the world for carbon audits and retrofitting? We put in place a 450 million fund, the BEEF fund. That fund ended in 2012. And did you know that 1/7 of all private sector buildings have done something. Now, the two power companies, through our, I think, midterm review, they've committed in the next 5 years to come up with about $100 million to help certain buildings to again do upgrading. So in total, Hong Kong has come up with about $550 million. That's the largest single sum of money any city has put out for dealing with buildings. Going forward, if what you're saying is give us more money from the public purse. Really? However, what we're interested in government is how do we talk to the private sector so that they can follow the leadership that the public sector has come across. So my conclusion is, number one, people do not understand or know what the public sector has actually done. That's our fault. We haven't told you. We haven't told you in a convenient way so you can see what we've done. Secondly is dealing with the private sector. We do have to talk to them.
So just to add on to that, in terms of what the business commitment is, or currently is maybe an example that's worth mentioning, just to make it really clear in case no one's heard this yet. BEC has retrofitted its own building. It is now being platinum. Okay? Platinum. All right. And then Robert. Robert is last.
I hear this thing about costs in building energy efficiency and so on, but I always like to remind the folks that the cost is recuperated in the long term. The issue in Hong Kong is we have such a good, wonderful low prices that it takes 7 to 10 years, which typically if you go across the border is maybe 3 years, and in the US it's maybe less. So as you can see that in the US, the green building retrofitting is picking up faster because the business case. So I guess what I want to say is it does take very forward-looking company to invest 7 to 10 years, which again within BC we do have members like Hong Kong Land and Swire has been doing a lot of, but how do you then encourage the smaller companies, which to be fair, they have to look on a year-to-year basis. And also from our members' feedback is that you can be forward-looking, but then you are at a disadvantage. So recent CE's address, there was talk of increased green labeling, as Christine said. Certainly that's a step in the right direction, and we will encourage the government to somehow make this green labeling, which is GBC, BEAM. I think that would be a step in the right direction. In Hong Kong, as we understand, it's very hard to say the government should intervene in the market, but I think making green labeling a mandatory, I hate to use the word, or a preference would be a step in the right direction. Companies that are forward-looking can not only invest in the long term, but the green labeling may help them also to be pushed in the right direction. So I think the government is going in the right direction. So the private sector is behind that. So please don't lose faith in the private sector. There are many companies that are already investing in this area.
Sorry, Alex.
Can I sneak in a very quick comment on buildings? Financing buildings before you make your point? Okay, two very quick things, and we have to talk about them more. I think, it's very easy to say this, but I think there is a very strong argument to be made that Hong Kong needs to start borrowing money to finance infrastructure, because everybody else in the world does this. I'm sure you all know about the municipal bond market in the United States. You know, this is out there. And just the very act of issuing fixed income instruments is good for the bond market here. We develop the yield curve. There are many reasons why one should do it. The second quick thing that we can discuss more is that the government doesn't necessarily have to put out more cash, but the government can lend its balance sheet to some of these projects. So take some of the risk, guarantee some of the downside, and that will bring the private sector in very efficiently.
I think these are exactly the things to talk about, and this is where I would like to encourage the financial services sector to get into explaining how this works to the financial sector.
Thank you. So Robert, last comment. I think we'll have to close it after
Okay. If you want to get the private sector to do things, it's much easier if it saves them money. further, if it's set up so that the better they do, the more money they save. You get the cost-effective projects happening. So our problem on this, as Eric has just said, is that the cost of electricity here is so low that a lot of this work doesn't happen very much. So what could government do? Well, one of the things it could do, and really I'm looking for comments from the other three members of the panel other than Christine, is it could do a revenue-neutral switch from charging us rates. So this building here, they pay property taxes, to paying a value-added tax on electricity. This thing could come in perhaps in phases over 5 years, so it doesn't make a rapid change. Further, once the system of green building labelling gets better, one could have variable amounts of rates depending on how good a building. If you've got a building which is platinum or whatever, maybe it can have a lower rateable charge. Once again, money speaks to the people who are making the decisions on spending money. And it's not just about electricity, it's also about water. I believe the amount of the user consumption charges is somewhere around about 25% of what it should be for the Water Supplies Department to get its targeted rate of return, which is a very modest rate of return, by the way. And what makes up the difference? Well, it's once again the property tax to a large extent. If we were to correct that by reducing the funding of the water supply from property taxes and put it onto usage charges, and here I'm thinking particularly usage charges on businesses, then we would have people looking at their payback for being more efficient in the way they use water as well as the way they use electricity, and we would move in the direction of decarbonising the economy. Thank you.
So some lots of good ideas there. Any closing remarks from our panelists before we close this session, and I hand it over to Eric to give the closing remarks.
Well, coming back to a more global perspective and challenge, I would like to just thank everybody, because I can see that there are many options, there are many ways in which Hong Kong can actually contribute to the general debate and provide some ideas and subjects of discussions, as also the EU has some ideas and some strategies which can maybe not implemented exactly in Hong Kong, but can also provide some insights.
All right, well, very quickly then, and I'm talking about the finance sector because that's the only thing I know about, but just in the broader context, finance was one of the sticking points in Lima. We know that. There was still real problems with the Green Climate Fund. And some of these things we've been talking about, these sort of new structures, financial instruments, are exactly the kinds of things that the Green Climate Fund is meant to do. And so I think the more that we either use the fund, go through the fund, or else actually are able to do similar things ourselves outside and create really strong positive examples of how these things can work, that's clearly going to be very helpful.
I also think if we look at the way we price electricity within Hong Kong, and we actually look at how different people will pay different prices, different tariffs, there may be some room there to actually generate some greater revenue to tackle some of the policy initiatives that we've seen. And then just a general comment, I think the next 12 to 18 months are going to be a very exciting time for energy policy in Hong Kong. We at WWF will certainly be firing some ideas into the debate, encouraging our members and others to give their input as well, encourage everybody in the room to do the same as well. We really feel there's a big opportunity for us to take a big step forward, and we look forward to engaging with everyone and hopefully working with the Hong Kong government to do just that. Thank you.
Well, we're very keen this year and next year to really look at all of these issues locally, but on an international front. I do urge people to take the advantage of COP21 coming, to look broadly at climate issues. Now, our climate paper, by the way, will also have extensive discussions about adaptation, which we haven't discussed today. There are other things that we haven't quite discussed today. And my point is, when we look at Hong Kong, we can either say, we are this little island, this city, and here's what we can do ourselves. But I also urge people, particularly when we look at energy-related issues, to look at the broader picture of what is happening across the border. eventually our grid will be linked to the one on the mainland. It won't happen in the next few years, so we're not talking about something in the short term. But as we look at 2030, 2050, that longer picture, in Hong Kong as a whole, not just for the government, but for the community, if we took an interest in the evolution of mainland Chinese policy, mainland Chinese energy infrastructure, and what they're trying to do, I think that's important for Hong Kong. I won't go further than that. And the last point about financing is, of course, Hong Kong is an important financial center for China as a whole. And there's already a lot that is happening there. Alexandra made a very, very important point, and that is the green transition, green financial services is there to provide the financial muscle for economies to become sustainable and low carbon. That is China's policy. China is looking at reforming her own banking system, her own, and building her financial services sector into how to finance the green transition in China. That's Chinese national policy. Question for Hong Kong is, what is our role? What is it that the private sector is doing and can do more of? In this bigger picture, what might Hong Kong be able to do? So, not necessarily always to look at Hong Kong independently, let's have our own carbon market here, our carbon market is the one that will serve China, not necessarily that way, but really to see it much more broadly. Because one of the most exciting things going forward for many years to come is the Chinese transition.
Very good, thank you. I think there's a lot to be had here. We did focus quite a bit on energy efficiency, on the climate finance discussion, carbon trading, and we haven't yet discussed resilience and adaptation. But there's more to come on that. CCBF has a keen eye on that, BDC, the work we're doing. So let's thank our panelists first. And I'd like to hand it over to Eric Chong to